My wedding day should have been the happiest day of my life, but instead my mother's voice cut through me like a blade. She called and said, "No one from this family will come to your wedding. Not your father, not me, not even Emily. Because your sister deserves this more than you." I sat in my gown, hands trembling, mascara running, realizing I would walk down that aisle completely alone. And when the ceremony ended and champagne was poured, my phone lit up with a flood of calls. 35 in total, all from her. Not out of love, not out of regret, but because she needed me to save Sophia's party. My name is Rachel Morgan, and this is how I learned the truth about family. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The lace of my wedding gown brushed against the hardwood floor as I sat on the small ivory chair in the bridal suite at Boston Harbor. My hands trembled in my lap, damp with sweat, despite the cool air drifting from the window. I kept telling myself this was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the day everything finally came together. The day I would stop being the overlooked daughter and simply be a bride. My phone buzzed on the vanity beside me. I grabbed it quickly, my heart lifting when I saw my mother's name. Finally, I thought she would wish me luck, maybe even tell me she and Dad were running late, but on their way. I pressed the phone to my ear, bracing myself for the warmth I had always longed for. But Linda's voice came through sharp and cold. "Rachel, you need to understand something. No one from this family is coming to your wedding. Not your father, not me, not even Emily. She's going to be with Sophia today. Your sister deserves this more than you." The words hit me like a slap. For a second I couldn't breathe. My lips parted, but nothing came out. My chest ached as though my heart had simply caved in. My mother's voice was steady, almost casual, as if she were telling me about the weather. I whispered, barely audible, "What? What did you just say?" "You heard me," she said flatly. "We can't be in two places at once. Sophia's engagement is more important for this family. You'll have to manage on your own." I pulled the phone away and stared at the screen until it went black. My reflection in the dark glass looked ghostly pale, my eyes wide and hollow. I folded the phone shut with trembling hands and bent forward, gasping as if I had been punched. The bodice of my gown tightened against my ribs. My breath came out in short bursts, loud in the silence of the room. The dress slipped from my knees and dragged across the floor as I slumped in the chair. I caught sight of myself in the mirror. Veil pinned neatly, mascara smudging at the corners from tears I hadn't even realized were falling. I pressed my palms to my face, smearing the makeup further. A knock rattled the door. "Rachel!" "They're ready for you," the coordinator called cheerfully from the hallway. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice, but all I could hear was my mother's sentence looping in my head. "No one from this family is coming. Even Emily. Your sister deserves this more than you." I forced myself upright, dabbed at my face with a tissue, and reapplied a thin coat of lipstick with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My stomach twisted, but I pasted on a smile. "That's what a bride does," I told myself. "She smiles no matter what." The door opened and the photographer peeked in. "You look stunning, Rachel. Time to line up." I nodded as though I believed him. The hallway spun around me as I stepped out. My heels clicked softly against the tile, each step carrying me farther from the desperate girl in the bridal suite and closer to the role I had to play. The music swelled outside. String Quartet, the song I had chosen months ago with such care. The coordinator touched my elbow, guiding me to the entrance. "Ready," she whispered. "Ready." The word felt like a cruel joke. I wasn't ready to walk down an aisle without my father at my side, without my mother dabbing her eyes, without Emily adjusting my veil. But there was no time left to argue with fate. The doors opened. A flood of light poured in. Guests rose from their seats, turning toward me with smiles and cameras flashing. I stepped forward, my veil drifting behind me, my bouquet trembling in my grip. I kept my gaze ahead, locked on David, waiting at the end of the aisle. His eyes were warm, steady, filled with the kind of love I had spent my whole life searching for. For a moment, that steadiness anchored me. But then my eyes flicked to the right, row after row of white chairs set aside for my family, every single one empty. The sunlight struck them cruelly, making them gleam like a spotlight on my humiliation. The string music carried me forward step by step. My smile held fragile and painted, but inside the words rang like a verdict I could not escape. No one from this family is coming. Even Emily, your sister deserves this more than you. And so I walked alone, a bride with mascara-streaked cheeks hidden beneath her veil, trying to look radiant while carrying the weight of abandonment in every step. When I was a little girl, our house in Boston looked like something from a magazine, at least from the outside. Tall windows, polished brick, the kind of home that made neighbors assume everything inside was perfect. But I knew the truth. Inside the walls told a different story, one where my place in the family was always somewhere in the shadows. My father, Richard, had once been a respected attorney known for his sharp arguments and steady presence in court. At home, though, he was quieter, more distant, as if the weight of his career had drained his ability to connect. My mother, Linda, thrived in social circles. She loved cocktail parties, charity galas, and her circle of friends at the country club. And then there was Sophia, my younger sister, the golden child, who could do no wrong. From the very beginning, it was obvious that Sophia was the star. She had the biggest bedroom on the second floor with French windows that opened to the garden. Every morning, sunlight poured in, draping her room in a warm glow. My room, on the other hand, was at the end of the hallway next to the staircase. It was narrow and dark, and every time someone went up or down the stairs, the walls vibrated. I told myself it didn't matter that I liked my small space because it was quiet, but every time I passed Sophia's door and saw her walls lined with expensive posters, new furniture, or a set of designer dresses hanging in her closet, my chest ached. I never said a word. I kept my head down, read my books, and convinced myself I didn't need what she had. But deep inside, I wished anyone would notice the imbalance. The clearest memory of that favoritism came when Sophia turned 16. Our backyard glowed with strings of fairy lights, the kind my mother insisted on importing from Italy. The lawn was crowded with Sophia's classmates laughing, holding plates of catered food while music thumped from rented speakers. I remember standing off to the side, clutching a small box in my hands. Inside was a bracelet I had spent weeks making, tiny beads strung carefully together, my best attempt at giving her something special. Then the moment came. My father wheeled out a red car, shiny and new, the kind of gift that made every kid in her class shriek with envy. Confetti burst into the air, cameras flashed, and Sophia squealed, throwing her arms around my parents. They kissed her cheeks, posed for pictures, and beamed like they had just handed her the world. I edged closer, my bracelet trembling in my fingers. "Happy birthday, Sophia," I whispered, handing her the box. She opened it quickly, gave it a glance, and muttered, "Thanks," before setting it aside on the buffet table. Her friends crowded around her, pulling her toward the car, snapping photos as she slid into the driver's seat. My parents followed, their arms around each other, grinning with pride. I stood there, still holding the empty box, my voice swallowed by the music. For a moment, one of the photographers gestured for me to step back so he could get a cleaner shot of Sophia with the car. I obeyed, moving out of the frame. What? It was as though I had never been there at all. The night air felt colder then, the laughter of her friends echoing in my ears. I slipped inside the house upstairs to my little room and sat on the edge of the bed. The walls shook as people stomped down the stairs outside. I stared at the bracelet box, empty now, and for the first time I realized my place was not beside them, but somewhere out of sight. That night, I made a decision I didn't even know I was making. If I couldn't be the daughter my parents celebrated, I would be the one who excelled where no one could ignore me. I would study harder, win scholarships, and prove I mattered, even if no one at home ever said so. Years later, when I earned a full scholarship to MIT, I carried that same determination with me. I came home waving the letter, hoping for pride in their eyes. Instead, my father said, "That will save us a lot of money." My mother gave a quick nod. "Good for you, Rachel." Then they turned back to a catalog of dresses for Sophia's upcoming dance. I learned then that no achievement of mine would ever glow as brightly in their eyes as Sophia simply existing. But that didn't stop me. I poured myself into my studies, pushed through internships, and built a career I could stand on. Every late night in the library, every exam I aced, every project I delivered was me whispering to myself, "You are worth something, even if they don't see it." Still, there were nights when the old ache returned. When I lay awake in my small apartment in Cambridge, staring at the ceiling, I thought back to that birthday night, the lights strung across the backyard. The laughter I wasn't part of the car gleaming under the spotlights. I thought about the way my parents' faces lit up when they looked at Sophia, and how those same faces barely changed when they looked at me. It was a pain I buried deep, but it never disappeared. It shaped me, sharpened me, and left me craving the recognition I knew I would never find at home. And as I sat there years later on my wedding day, walking down that aisle with no family to stand by me, I realized those seeds of abandonment had been planted long ago in a backyard strung with lights where I learned to disappear from the picture. The invitations went out 10 months before the ceremony, carefully printed on thick ivory paper with gold trim. I wrote every name by hand, sealed every envelope myself, imagining the joy on the faces of the people I loved when they opened them. When I handed one directly to my parents over dinner, my mother slipped it into her purse without a glance. "We'll see," she said lightly, as if I'd invited her to a neighborhood barbecue, not my wedding. My father didn't say anything at all. Later, he texted me a single thumbs-up emoji. I laughed it off at the time, pretended it didn't sting, told myself they were just busy. But the truth was, their indifference was already a familiar script. I tried not to let it sink in, not with so many other details to manage. Guest lists, seating charts, floral arrangements. I told David it was fine that they were just not the sentimental type. He gave me that look, the one that said he didn't believe me but wouldn't push. One evening after work, I sat in my office at the tech firm in Cambridge, the city lights flickering outside the window, and decided I needed to hear it straight from them. My hands hovered over the phone for several minutes before I finally pressed call. My mother picked up on the second ring, her voice brisk as always. "Mom, I just wanted to make sure you and Dad got the invitation," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my tone. "It's been months since I sent it, and I really wanted to confirm. You'll be there, right?" There was a pause on the other end, then the clink of ice in a glass. "Rachel, you have to understand something," she said finally. "Sophia needs us more right now. Her engagement is a huge event. Her fiancé's family is flying in from Europe. We can't afford to miss it." I felt my stomach drop, the air knocked out of me. My fingers tightened around the phone until my knuckles whitened. But it's my wedding, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady, aware of 2 colleagues still working at their desks nearby. I forced a smile across my face so they wouldn't see the storm inside me. "It's not that we don't care, my mother," continued her voice almost casual. "It's just, Sophia's marriage will set the tone for her future. There are important connections involved. Your wedding is nice, but it's not on the same level. You're already settled with David. You'll be fine." Her words cut deeper than she could have known. Or maybe she knew exactly. I pressed my forehead to the palm of my hand, nodding silently, even though she couldn't see me. "I see," I whispered. "Good girl," she said, then added, "We'll send something. Don't worry." And she hung up. I sat there for a long time, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the tapping of keyboards across the office. Everything felt far away. My colleagues laughed quietly at some shared joke, and I curled my lips into a smile as though I were part of it, though my insides had turned to ice. I placed the phone face down on the desk and stared at the reflection of myself in the black screen, a woman about to marry the man she loved, but somehow still the daughter never chosen. I wanted to scream, to demand why I was always second place, But instead I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue and forced myself to type out a project email, as if nothing had happened. Walking home that night through the streets of Cambridge, the autumn wind whipped at my hair. I replayed my mother's words again and again. "Your wedding is nice, but not on the same level." I thought about the gold-trimmed invitations stacked neatly on my kitchen counter. The months of planning the money saved the dreams of walking down the aisle with my parents in the front row. And all of it dismissed, just like every report card, every scholarship, every small victory of mine had been brushed aside in favor of Sophia's spotlight. When I reached my apartment, David was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. He looked up and smiled, warmth filling his eyes. "Long day?" he asked. I swallowed the truth, forcing a nod. "Yeah, just work stuff." He didn't press, and I was grateful. I didn't want him carrying the weight of their rejection with me. I wanted our wedding day to belong to us, not to be poisoned by their absence before it even happened. But as I lay awake later staring at the ceiling, the words wouldn't stop echoing. "Sophia needs us more. Your wedding isn't on the same level." The ache pressed deeper than I expected, sharper, because I had already known somewhere inside what her answer would be. I had braced myself, and still the wound bled. In that quiet moment, I understood something. This wasn't just about one day. It was about years of being told in ways subtle and blunt that I would never come first. Hearing it spoken so plainly only confirmed what I had carried all along, and the knowledge settled over me like a cold, familiar blanket. 3 days before the wedding, my phone lit up with Emily's name. For a moment, relief washed over me. Finally, someone who had always been in my corner, someone I could count on to show up. I answered with a smile already tugging at my lips. "Hey, Em," I said, trying to sound casual, though my nerves were frayed. Her voice came hesitant, almost apologetic. "Rachel, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll understand." The smile slipped from my face. "What is it?" She exhaled heavily. "I can't be at your wedding. Sophia's engagement party. There are going to be so many people there I need to meet. Key contacts, potential clients. It's really important for my career." I froze, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Wait. What Emily you promised? You're my maid of honor. You cried when I told you David proposed. You said you'd be standing beside me." "I know," she said quickly, her words tumbling over themselves. "I know how much it means. But you'll have David and your colleagues, and I just can't miss this opportunity. Please don't be angry." Angry wasn't even the right word. It was something deeper, a hollowing inside my chest. I sat down on the edge of the bed, teeth sinking into my thumbnail until I tasted the metallic tang of blood. My eyes stung, hot tears spilling over before I could stop them. "Contacts," I whispered, my voice shaking. "That's more important than my wedding." She was silent for a beat. "Then softer, I'll make it up to you. I promise." I ended the call before she could say more. The screen went black, and in the reflection I saw my own face blotchy with tears, mascara streaking down my cheeks. I buried my head in my hands, sobbing quietly so David in the living room wouldn't hear. The ache of betrayal spread like wildfire through me. Emily wasn't just a friend. She had been my anchor. I remembered us at MIT huddled in the library at 2 a.m, stacks of books spread across the table. She'd pull me through when I doubted myself. "You've got this." "Rach," she'd whisper, sliding a coffee across the table to keep me awake. We'd laugh about professors, cry about breakups, share secrets no one else knew. She knew about the nights I hid in my tiny dorm room because I couldn't stand hearing my parents gush about Sophia on the phone. She had promised me back then that I wasn't invisible. And now she was choosing Sophia too. I got up, pacing the bedroom. My dress hung in the closet. The veil, neatly pressed shoes waiting in their box. Everything was ready, except the people I thought would hold me up. One by one, they had stepped away. My parents, my sister by default, And now Emily. I sank back onto the bed, curling my legs underneath me, hugging a pillow to my chest. I could hear laughter drifting up from the street outside, students walking past, free and happy, in ways I hadn't felt in weeks. I envied their lightness, their unawareness. My phone buzzed again. Emily leaving a voicemail. I couldn't bring myself to listen. I knew it would be more excuses, more talk about career and networking. Words that couldn't replace the presence of the girl who was supposed to fix my veil and hold my bouquet and whisper encouragement before I walked down the aisle. I wiped my face with the corner of the pillow, smearing more makeup. My chest tightened. For years I had believed Emily was proof that not everyone abandoned me, that at least one person had chosen me without condition. And yet at the very moment I needed her most, she had turned away. The house was quiet, too quiet. I sat there in the dim light, the ticking of the wall clock growing louder with every second. My hands trembled as I tried to calm myself, tried to breathe through the storm. But the storm only swelled. I thought of David, his steady eyes, his unwavering love. He was all I had left now. Everyone else had chosen Sophia. Everyone else had found a reason to step out of my life on the day that was supposed to be mine. I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling, tears still sliding into my hairline. My body ached from the tension, my nails bitten down to the quick. And in the silence, a truth settled over me. I had lost the last person I thought I could lean on. Emily had made her choice, and I was left holding the weight of it alone. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright, the kind of May Day people dream about for ceremonies by the water. The harbor sparkled as though it had been polished overnight, and the breeze carried the faint scent of salt and blooming lilacs from the garden beyond the terrace. Rows of chairs draped in white linen with lavender ribbons tied neatly around each back stretched out before the arch where David waited. It was everything I had planned for, everything I had saved for, and yet all I could feel was the emptiness where my family should have been. The string quartet began the first notes of Pachelbel's canon. My knees nearly buckled as the coordinator nudged me forward. The veil floated around my shoulders, the bouquet heavy in my grip. I forced my lips into a smile as the guests rose, faces beaming, phones raised to capture the moment. My co-workers from Cambridge waved, a few college friends clapped softly, and David's relatives nodded approvingly. Waddi. But then my eyes swept to the row set aside at the very front, reserved for my parents, my sister, my closest friend. Every chair was vacant. They stood out like missing teeth in a perfect smile, glaring reminders of absence. The sunlight hit the empty seats, and for a second I thought I might collapse right there in the aisle. I locked my gaze on David. He was steady, his eyes warm, his mouth curving into a smile meant just for me. He reached his hand out as I walked, and that small gesture kept me moving forward step by step, as though his strength alone pulled me down the aisle. When I reached him, his fingers closed over mine. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his eyes searching my face as if to read the storm behind my veil. "Thank you," I murmured, blinking back tears. The officiant's words washed over me, and I recited my vows with a voice that sounded strangely detached, like someone else speaking through me. I could hear applause, feel the gentle press of David's lips against mine, the cheering of guests, but inside all I could hear was silence. The silence of my parents, not clapping my sister, not cheering Emily, not laughing beside me. The photographs came next. I smiled until my cheeks ached, posing with colleagues, hugging David's cousins, holding bouquets high with the bridesmaids David's sister had arranged at the last minute. I tilted my head just right, made sure the light caught my gown, laughed on cue when someone cracked a joke. To anyone watching, I was a radiant bride. But behind every flash of the camera, I felt like porcelain, cracking each smile a fracture I had to conceal. When the crowd moved toward the reception tent, I slipped back to the bridal suite. The air conditioning brushed against my damp skin, cooling the sweat at the base of my neck. I closed the door finally alone and let the bouquet drop onto the vanity. My chest heaved as if I'd been holding my breath the entire ceremony. That's when my phone buzzed on the table. Once, twice, 3 times, then continuously like an alarm that wouldn't stop. I picked it up, my eyes widening as the screen lit up. 35 missed calls, all from Mom. A text followed, bold and insistent. "We need to talk immediately." My hands shook. For one insane second, I thought maybe they had changed their minds, maybe they were pulling into the parking lot, regret finally hitting them too late. But then the old ache twisted in my gut, the instinct I'd carried since childhood, whispering otherwise. The phone rang again. I declined it, pressing the screen hard as though that could silence the pounding in my chest. I set it face down, but the vibrations continued rattling against the glass tabletop like an angry insect. I stared at myself in the mirror. The veil was slightly crooked mascara smudged in the corners of my eyes. My face looked pale, drawn, but the lipstick was still intact. I dabbed at my cheeks with a tissue, willing myself to pull it together. This was still my wedding day. There was a knock at the door. "Rachel, time for group photos," the photographer called. I inhaled deeply, grabbed the bouquet, and pasted the smile back on. "Coming." I answered, my voice too bright, too rehearsed. As I stepped outside the harbor, breeze caught my veil again, lifting it lightly. Guests were waiting, laughing glasses of champagne already in hand. David stood at the center of them, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. He reached for me instantly, wrapping his arm around my waist, shielding me without even knowing what I had just endured inside that room. I tilted my head toward him, smiling for the camera, while inside my mother's message screamed in silence. 35 calls. "We need to talk immediately." The photographer lifted his camera, capturing our image against the glittering harbor. I pressed myself closer to David, smiling with everyone else, though beneath the lace and the laughter all I could feel was the sharp, relentless sting of abandonment, echoing through me like a wound that refused to close. By the time the reception lights dimmed and the music slowed, I thought I had survived the worst of it. I had smiled through every toast, laughed at jokes that barely registered, and held David's hand until my fingers cramped. I excused myself after the cake cutting, slipping into a quiet corner of the bridal suite where the noise of clinking glasses and chatter faded to a muffled hum. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't my mother. The name on the screen made my breath hitch. Amelia, my cousin. The one person in the extended family who had always kept in touch with me even when others didn't bother. She was blunt, but kind, a freelance journalist who believed in telling the truth no matter how uncomfortable. I opened her first message. "You won't believe what they're saying about you at Sophia's party." My throat tightened. I sat down hard on the chair by the vanity, clutching the phone as though it might burn me. Another message came in, and then another. I tapped the screen with trembling fingers. "Your mom told people you scheduled your wedding on purpose to ruin Sophia's engagement. She said you wanted to steal attention from her." The words blurred in front of my eyes. My chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. I shook my head, whispering to the empty room. "That's not true. That's not true." The next message appeared almost instantly. "Your dad added that you've been distant from the family for years, so it's no surprise none of them showed up. He made it sound like you abandoned them, not the other way around." The phone slipped in my sweaty hands. My elbow hit the edge of the table, knocking over a half-full glass of water. It crashed to the floor, shattering water soaking into the hem of my gown. I barely noticed. My hands were shaking too hard as I bent to pick up the pieces, my phone vibrating against the wood above me with another notification. I climbed back into the chair and opened Amelia's latest text. "And Emily. She told people you didn't want her there because you were controlling about the guest list. She said you fought her when she wanted to bring extra business contacts, and that's why she chose Sophia's party instead." A sharp pain spread through my chest. Emily, who had held me during nights I cried about being invisible in my own family. Emily, who once swore she'd never leave me to face anything alone. The betrayal cut deeper than anything my parents could say. I pressed the phone to my chest and curled forward, gasping. My gown clung damply to my legs where the spilled water had soaked through. The room tilted my reflection in the mirror, fractured and strange. I wanted to scream, to storm into Sophia's party and confront them all, but I sat frozen, the words of people who were supposed to love me echoing louder than the music outside. My mother's lie painted me as selfish. My father's words made me sound cold and estranged. Emily's twisting of the truth turned me into a monster who drove her away. Together, their voices wove a version of me that didn't exist. Someone petty, vindictive, unworthy. And yet I knew that in that ballroom across town, full of my family's friends and Sophia's glittering new in-laws, people were nodding, believing it. Another buzz. Amelia again. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I just thought you should know what's happening." "You don't deserve this." I swallowed hard, forcing my fingers to type. "Thank you for telling me. Please don't say anything else tonight. Just keep me updated if it gets worse." She replied with a single line, "I've got you." I set the phone down carefully as though it were a fragile piece of glass about to crack. My hands were still shaking, my nails digging half-moon crescents into my palms. I stood and crossed the room, staring out the window at the harbor. The city lights flickered across the water reflections, breaking apart with every ripple. Inside, my heart was tearing in two. It wasn't just that they had abandoned me on my wedding day. It was that they had rewritten my story in real time, branding me the villain in front of strangers and relatives alike. They hadn't just stayed away. They had chosen to erase me and replace me with a caricature of selfishness that suited their narrative. I pressed my forehead against the glass, breathing in the faint smell of salt and roses still clinging to the air from the ceremony. My mascara streaked against the pane, leaving faint black marks. When I turned back toward the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. My gown was still pristine, but my face looked raw, vulnerable, stripped of the bride I was supposed to be. I wiped at my eyes, whispering to no one, "Why is it never enough? Why am I never enough for them?" The laughter from the reception hall swelled faintly as the band struck up another song. For a moment I closed my eyes, listening to the cheer, letting it wash against the ache inside me. But the ache didn't lessen. It only hardened like a scar forming beneath the surface, one I knew I would carry long after the music ended. And that night I understood something cruel and undeniable. Being abandoned was one wound, but being slandered by those you loved most was another altogether. They hadn't just left me behind. They had turned me into a story they could despise, and that was a truth I couldn't unhear. Another message from Amelia appeared, and this time it wasn't just words. It was a photo. My breath caught as I tapped it open, the image filling the screen. Sophia stood in the center of a lavish ballroom, her smile wide under the chandeliers. Around her neck, glittering under the lights, was a sapphire and diamond necklace I knew better than my own reflection. My fingers tightened so hard around the phone I thought the glass might crack. That necklace had once rested in the fragile hands of my grandmother, Evelyn. I could still see her face in 2019, pale and lined with the weight of her final days, when she asked me to sit at her bedside. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice raspy but clear, "there is something I want you to keep. This necklace isn't just jewelry. It is a reminder. One day when you wear it at your wedding, remember that marriage is built on love, not competition. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She had pressed the velvet box into my hands, her thin fingers curling over mine. Tears blurred my vision as I promised I would treasure it, not for its price, but for the bond between us. I kissed her hand and whispered, "I will, Grandma." After she passed, I asked my mother about the necklace. Linda barely looked up from the kitchen counter where she was flipping through a stack of glossy magazines. "It's broken," she said casually. The sapphire cracked. "Worthless now." I put it away. I had wanted to argue, to insist that couldn't be true, but my father cut in with his usual finality. "Let it go, Rachel. It's not worth fighting over." I had stood there in stunned silence, the promise I made to Grandma burning in my chest. Part of me doubted their words, but another part wanted desperately to believe. I told myself maybe Evelyn had been confused, maybe I had imagined the moment, or maybe I just didn't deserve to hold on to it. I buried the memory deep, convincing myself what mattered most was the time I'd spent with her, not a piece of jewelry. But now, staring at the photo on my phone, every lie unraveled. The sapphire gleamed flawless, the diamonds catching every angle of light. Sophia's hand rested delicately against it, as if it were her crown, her ticket to shine even brighter. The guests around her looked on with admiration, some snapping photos, others whispering with envy. My chest constricted and the room spun. I sank onto the edge of the vanity chair, gripping the fabric of my gown so hard it bunched beneath my nails. Heat flushed up my neck, not from shame this time, but from fury. They had stolen it. The necklace wasn't broken. It hadn't been tucked away in a drawer forgotten. It had been ripped from me just like every other moment that should have been mine. I pressed the phone against my forehead, my breath coming fast. My grandmother's voice echoed through me so real I thought for a second she was standing in the room. Wear it at your wedding. Remember love, not competition. Instead, on the day I married the man who cherished me, my family paraded that necklace at Sophia's engagement party. They turned it into a trophy, flaunting it as if it had always belonged to her. The betrayal pierced deeper than any words my parents or Emily had said. This was Evelyn's final gift, her last expression of love for me, and they had twisted it into Sophia's prize. I couldn't stop the tears then. They streamed hot and relentless, smearing what was left of my makeup. I clutched the phone to my chest, rocking slightly in the chair, whispering, "How could they do this? How could they take her away from me?" Even now, I thought back to every time I had stepped aside for Sophia. The bedroom, the birthday car, the scholarships ignored, the wedding invitations dismissed. And now even the most sacred heirloom was stolen, wrapped around her neck as though my grandmother's love had never been mine at all. A sharp knock at the door startled me. "Rachel, more photos," the coordinator chirped. I swiped at my face, quickly shoved the phone into my clutch, and forced myself to stand. In the mirror, I saw a bride who looked like she had been crying for hours. I dabbed at my cheeks with a tissue reapplied lipstick with an unsteady hand, and practiced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. When I stepped back into the reception tent, the laughter and music enveloped me, but I felt like a ghost moving among the living. Guests complimented my gown, clinked glasses with me, hugged me tightly. David kissed my cheek, searching my face for signs of what I was hiding. I smiled, nodded, let them all believe I was glowing with joy. But inside, the glow had died. What remained was a fire. Quiet, simmering, relentless. For years I had told myself I was imagining the favoritism, exaggerating the slight. Now there was proof. Cold, gleaming proof around my sister's neck. I lifted my champagne flute when someone toasted us, but my hands trembled so badly the glass rattled. I pressed it to my lips anyway, swallowing bitterness that tasted nothing like celebration. I looked out across the harbor, the lights shimmering on the water, and I thought of Evelyn again, how her hand had felt in mine, how her eyes had softened when she gave me the necklace. That memory was mine. That promise was mine. And I knew then that one day I would take it back. Not just the necklace, but every piece of myself they had tried to erase. The music swelled, the guests laughed, and I stood smiling among them, carrying a secret grief that no one else could see. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. David's steady breathing rose and fell beside me, his arm draped loosely across my waist. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind refusing to rest. Every image from the day replayed itself. The empty row of chairs, the 35 calls from my mother Amelia's messages, and that picture of Sophia flaunting the necklace that should have been mine. Carefully, I slid out from under David's arm, pressing a kiss to his shoulder so he wouldn't stir. I padded barefoot across the hardwood floor, the hem of my nightgown brushing my ankles, and opened my laptop. The glow of the screen lit up the dark room with an eerie blue. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment, before I began pulling up everything I had received. One by one, I opened Amelia's texts and screenshots, saving each into a new folder I labeled simply, "For Later." Every lie my parents had spoken, every twisted word from Emily, every image of Sophia in that necklace. I saved them all. I clicked through my call log and captured the endless string of missed calls from Linda, her text demanding I call immediately. I recorded them not because I wanted to hear her voice, but because I knew someday proof would matter. Next, I opened my email and scrolled until I found the attachment I hadn't looked at in years, the scanned copy of my grandmother Evelyn's will. My hands trembled as I clicked. The PDF loaded slowly, the words swimming into view. And there it was in black and white. The sapphire and diamond necklace shall be given to my granddaughter Rachel Morgan to be worn on her wedding day, as a reminder that love is the most important foundation of marriage. I traced the sentence on the screen with my fingertip, my throat tightening. It was as though she were speaking to me again from that bedside in 2019, her hand frail, but her eyes fierce with love. Tears blurred the screen, dripping onto the keyboard, but I didn't wipe them away. I whispered to the empty room, "You wanted me to have it. You trusted me." The tears came harder, then shaking my whole body. "Nid." I pressed my hands to my face, sobbing into the silence, trying not to wake David. All the years of being overlooked, diminished, erased. It felt like they were crashing down at once. But beneath the grief, something else flickered. A spark. I straightened slowly, wiping my face with the back of my hand. The necklace wasn't gone. The truth wasn't lost. I had proof, real proof, that they had lied and stolen from me. I sat back down and began organizing the folder, meticulously labeling each file with dates and names, creating subfolders for wedding day, family, lies, inheritance. The meticulousness calmed me, turned chaos into order. Every click was an act of defiance, a promise to myself that I wouldn't be silenced again. When I was finished, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The laptop fan whirred quietly, the city sounds drifting in. Distant sirens, the low hum of traffic on Memorial Drive, a dog barking somewhere in the night. I looked over at David, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm raging inside me. For a moment I felt guilty for keeping it from him. But then I thought of his smile at the altar, the way his eyes had softened when he saw me. I wanted him to carry that joy without the shadow of my family's cruelty tainting it. I whispered softly, "Not yet. One day, but not yet." The clock on the wall ticked past 2 in the morning. My eyes burned heavy with fatigue. I shut the laptop and slid back into bed, curling against David's warmth. He stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent, then pulled me closer in his sleep. I pressed my forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. My tears had dried, leaving only the faint tracks on my cheeks. In the dark, with his arms around me, I made a vow. I would wait. I would gather strength, build a life, and when the time was right, I would use the truth they thought they had buried. For now, silence would be my weapon. But later would come. The months after the wedding blurred into a steady rhythm of long hours and late nights. Work became my refuge, the place where I could bury myself in something measurable, where effort equaled results, and no one could pretend not to see me. At the Cambridge tech startup where I had been climbing for years, I threw myself into every project, every pitch, every product launch. My calendar filled with deadlines and my apartment overflowed with sticky notes and binders. In early 2023, the CEO called me into his office, a corner room with a wall of glass that overlooked the Charles River. He gestured for me to sit, and I smoothed my skirt, heart pounding. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, "Rachel, you've proven yourself again and again. You're ready for the next step. We'd like you to take over as senior project manager." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then the words sank in, and I felt my chest swell with something close to pride. Not the empty kind I'd once begged for from my parents, but the kind I had carved out myself, brick by brick, night by night. When I walked back to my desk, colleagues clapped a few, patted my shoulder. "Congrats, Rachel," one said. Another added, "About time." I smiled, thanking them, but inside I whispered, "If only Grandma could see this." With the promotion came a pay raise, and for the first time in my life I felt bold enough to look at real estate listings. David and I spent weekends touring apartments, most of them too cramped or too cold, until one Sunday afternoon we stepped into a unit overlooking the Charles. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, sunlight spilling onto polished oak floors. The river shimmered just beyond boats drifting lazily under the bridges. David wrapped an arm around my shoulders and whispered, "I can see us here." I nodded, blinking back tears. "So can I." We signed the papers 2 weeks later. Moving in felt like stepping into a new chapter. Every morning I stood at the window with coffee in my hand, watching the light dance across the water, and told myself, "This is mine. No one can take this from me." David, meanwhile, had landed a commission to redesign a community center in Dorchester. He sketched late into the night drafts spread across the dining table, eyes alight with ideas. One evening, he looked up from his plans and said, "What if we tied this into your network? Get some of the tech firms you know to sponsor the computer lab." I loved the thought of blending our worlds, of building something bigger than ourselves. Over the next months, I arranged meetings, pitched sponsorships, convinced partners that this project mattered. We raised enough money not only for a computer lab, but also for a new library wing. When the center finally reopened, the mayor cut the ribbon. Cameras flashed, and David and I stood shoulder to shoulder as our names were mentioned in the local press. The Boston Globe ran a piece, "Local Couple Champions Community Renewal." Seeing my name in print that way, not as someone's daughter or sister, but as myself, filled me with a quiet, fierce satisfaction. At work, though, whispers circulated. In the break room, I overheard 2 co-workers murmuring, "Did you hear? Her parents didn't even show up at her wedding?" "Yeah, the Carters. Old Boston family, right? Weird." I pretended not to hear, stirring sugar into my coffee, but my hands trembled. Later, another colleague, braver or simply nosier, asked outright, "So, Rachel, is it true your family skipped the wedding?" I smiled tightly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. It was a small thing. They had other commitments. Then I walked away before he could press further. The truth was too raw to share, and I refused to let their absence define me here in the one place where I had built something solid. At home, I told David about the whispers. He frowned, setting down his pen. "Do you want me to say something? Set the record straight." I shook my head. "No. Let them think what they want. I know what's real." Still, the question lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that never fully faded. No matter how much I achieved, there would always be the unspoken why. Why hadn't they been there? Why hadn't they cared? One evening, after a long day of back-to-back meetings, I sat on our balcony overlooking the river. The city lights shimmered across the water, and the sounds of traffic drifted up faintly. David joined me, setting 2 glasses of wine on the table. He leaned back in his chair, sighing. "We're building something good, you know. This," he gestured at the view, the life we were shaping. "This is our family. Ceci." I looked at him, his face lit by the soft glow of the city, and for the first time in a long while I felt the knot in my chest loosen. He was right. Family wasn't always the people who shared your blood. Sometimes it was the ones who chose to stand beside you day after day without conditions. I reached across the table, lacing my fingers with his. "Yeah," I said softly. "This is our family." And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the city and the steady warmth of his hand, I believed it. It was early spring of 2025 when Amelia's message came through. I had just returned from a late client meeting, still in my blazer shoes, pinching my feet when my phone buzzed. Her name lit up the screen and I almost ignored it, expecting another casual check-in. But when I read the words, my heart slammed against my ribs. Sophia's wedding is set for the Plaza Hotel in New York. She'll be wearing the necklace. I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, my grocery bags sliding off the counter, apples rolling across the floor. The image of that necklace around her throat burned into my mind again, the betrayal renewed as fresh as the night I saw it in Amelia's photo. I typed back, my fingers stiff. "Are you certain?" Seconds later, her reply. "Absolutely. They've already told the press. The jewelry designer who restored it is boasting about it online." My knees nearly buckled. I sank into a chair, gripping the phone with both hands. After years of waiting silence patience, the moment I had dreaded and longed for in equal measure had arrived. Sophia was going to flaunt the heirloom in front of the entire world. That night I barely slept. I lay awake beside David, staring at the ceiling, my pulse thundering in my ears. I knew I couldn't let it happen again, not without consequence. The next morning I called Vincent Harper. He had been recommended years ago by a colleague, a man known in Boston's legal circles for his work in inheritance disputes. His office overlooked Beacon Hill, all polished mahogany and framed degrees, the kind of place that carried its own authority. He rose when I entered, tall and composed, his handshake firm, but not overbearing. "Rachel," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. Amelia filled me in on the basics. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" I opened the folder I had carried for years, thick now with screenshots, emails, and documents. My hands shook as I spread them across his desk. The scanned will from 2019. The messages from Amelia, the photos of Sophia wearing the necklace at her engagement party, the call log from my mother's 35 attempts to reach me. Vincent studied each page carefully, nodding slightly. At one point, he leaned back, folded his hands under his chin, and said, "This is airtight. The will is explicit." "The necklace was meant for you and your family, not only concealed it, but misappropriated it. If they display it again, especially in such a public forum, it will be their undoing." Hearing those words spoken so firmly nearly broke me. For years I had doubted my own memory, my own worth. Now a man whose career was built on truth and law was telling me I was right. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Vincent's eyes met mine, sharp and steady. "We prepare a legal notice citing the clause in your grandmother's will. We attach every piece of evidence you've collected. And then," he allowed himself the faintest smile, "we deliver it at the height of their celebration, when the cameras are flashing, when the world is watching. That way they can't bury it or twist it. The truth will speak for itself." I exhaled, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. "During the wedding?" "Yes," he said simply. "Mid-ceremony. We'll time it for maximum impact. Their arrogance is your leverage." A surge of heat spread through me, fear tangled with exhilaration. I imagined Sophia striding down the aisle in her designer gown, the necklace catching every light, my parents glowing with pride. And then I imagined the silence that would follow as the notice was handed to them, the whispers, the cameras capturing their faces as the facade cracked. For the first time, the balance shifted. I wasn't the abandoned daughter anymore. I wasn't the shadow in the background. I had power. Vincent began gathering the documents, sliding them into a neat pile. "You've done most of the work already, Rachel. Collecting, preserving, waiting. Now it's about timing. Do you want to move forward?" I felt my throat tighten, but I nodded. "Yes, I want to do this." His expression softened just slightly. "Then let's give you back what should have been yours all along." When I left his office, the streets of Beacon Hill felt sharper, brighter. I walked past brick townhouses and budding trees with my fists clenched, my pulse racing. The air smelled of rain, the sky heavy with clouds, but for the first time in years I didn't feel weighed down. I felt propelled. That night I told David part of the truth, that Sophia's wedding was set, that there might be legal action surrounding an inheritance. I didn't tell him about the timing, about the plan to make it public. Not yet. I wanted him free of the burden until it was done. He kissed my forehead, whispered, "Whatever happens, I'm with you." And I clung to him, swallowing the tears that rose. Later, alone in the living room, I stared out the window at the Charles River, the water glinting under the city lights. My reflection stared back at me, pale but resolute. This time I thought, pressing my palm to the glass, they won't rewrite my story. This time the truth will not only come to light, it will blind them. The Plaza's ballroom glowed like something out of a dream, dripping in chandeliers, and crystal lined with orchids so white they looked almost unreal. Guests in designer gowns and tuxedos mingled at tables set with gold-rimmed china photographers circling like hawks. The moment Sophia entered the room seemed to tilt toward her. Her gown trailed behind her in yards of satin, and every flash of the cameras found the sapphire and diamond necklace at her throat. From the corner of the room I watched silently, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every step she took felt like a taunt, the necklace gleaming under the lights as if it belonged to her. I clenched my clutch tighter, the edge digging into my palm, reminding me why I was there. At exactly 3:15, my phone vibrated. A single message from Vincent sent. Almost instantly, I saw the ripple move through the crowd. Guests pulled out their phone screens, lighting up as whispers broke out across the ballroom. Sophia faltered mid-step, her smile stiffening as she looked toward my parents, who were already huddled together, scrolling furiously. The hum of gossip rose sharp and electric. Then the doors opened and Vincent strode in. Calm, deliberate, his suit impeccable, a red-sealed envelope in his hand. The photographers turned on him as though they sensed the drama shutters clicking. He walked straight to the front where Sophia stood beneath the floral arch, her fiancé beside her, confusion clouding his face. "Excuse me, Vincent," said his voice carrying easily across the room. He handed the document to the wedding planner, who paled as her eyes scanned the text, then passed it to my father. Richard's jaw clenched, his face turning the color of ash. "This is a formal legal notice regarding misappropriation of inherited property," Vincent continued. "The necklace currently displayed is the rightful possession of Rachel Morgan per the will of the late Evelyn Carter." Gasps spread through the guests. Cameras flashed wildly. Sophia's hand flew to her chest, covering the stones as though she could shield them from the truth. My father snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is absurd! You have no right to interrupt!" Vincent didn't flinch. "The will is clear, and if the necklace continues to be displayed, every moment is being documented for court. You are exposing yourselves further." My mother. Linda broke then. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, tears spilling as she wailed, "Why now? Why here? You're ruining her day." But the tide had already turned. The hotel manager stepped forward, his expression grim. "We cannot allow the event to continue under legal dispute. The necklace must be removed immediately." Sophia's fiancé looked from the paper to her, his face hardening. "Is this true?" he asked under his breath, but the microphones caught it, carrying his words through the hushed ballroom. Sophia's skin had drained of color, her lips trembling. She looked toward my parents for rescue, but they were locked in their own panic. My father arguing in vain with Vincent, my mother sobbing into her lace gloves. The cameras didn't look away, neither did the guests. Slowly, with fingers that shook, Sophia unclasped the necklace. The sound of the clasp clicking open was swallowed by the silence pressing down on all of us. She lowered it into her palm. Her head bent, her hair spilling forward to hide her face. That was when my phone rang. My mother's name lit the screen. I stepped into the hallway, the noise of the ballroom muffled behind me, and answered. Her voice was shrill, furious through her tears. "Rachel, do you have any idea what you've done? You destroyed your sister's wedding. Everyone is watching. Everyone is whispering." I cut her off, my own voice steadier than I expected. "Do you remember my wedding, Mom? Do you remember the empty chairs you left behind because Sophia needed you more? You weren't there when I walked down the aisle alone. And now you want me to care about her humiliation. This isn't revenge. This is justice. This is what you chose." For a long moment there was only her ragged breathing. Then she choked out, "You've always been jealous." "No," I said sharply. "I've always been invisible." "Not anymore." I ended the call before she could respond. My hand shook as I lowered the phone, but my chest felt lighter as though years of silence had finally cracked open. Back in the ballroom, I could see Sophia clutching her gown with one hand, the necklace gone from her throat, her face buried in her fiancé's shoulder as guests whispered behind their hands. The flashes of the cameras never stopped immortalizing her shame. And in that moment, as she bowed her head under the weight of hundreds of eyes, I knew the balance had shifted forever. The fallout came faster than even I imagined. By the next morning, headlines splashed across every major news site. Heirloom belongs to Rachel Morgan. One read in bold letters on the New York Times homepage. Another tabloid ran side-by-side photos, Sophia radiant at the start of the ceremony, then pale and bare-necked as the necklace was taken away. The story spread like wildfire. At my office in Cambridge, coworkers stopped by my desk with sidelong glances, pretending they weren't reading the articles on their phones. David fielded questions from colleagues at his firm too, but he shielded me from most of it. We both knew the truth spoke louder than anything we could add. Within days, Sophia's carefully curated image crumbled. Her new in-laws from Switzerland, a family deeply rooted in tradition and discretion, were furious. Whispers swirled that they had confronted her after the wedding, demanding why she and her parents had hidden the will. She tried to cry her way out of it, but respect once lost is not easily regained. Their warmth turned cold, and I knew the distance would only widen. Emily, too, faced her reckoning. The PR firm she worked for in Manhattan suddenly distanced itself from her. Deals she had bragged about securing fell through. Old contacts stopped returning her calls. I heard through Amelia that several people in the industry said they didn't want to be associated with the woman tied to the Carter scandal. For someone who had traded friendship for business connections, it was the most fitting punishment. As for my parents, they disappeared from society pages altogether. The Carters, once hosts of glittering charity galas in Boston, stopped receiving invitations. Linda avoided her bridge club. Richard, once so proud of his legal career, retired fully into the shadows. Amelia told me she'd seen them once at a restaurant, alone eyes downcast, whispering to each other like people afraid of being overheard. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. Their silence was enough. A year passed. In May of 2026, David surprised me on the evening of our anniversary. He cooked dinner himself, though he wasn't much of a cook. Pasta that boiled too long. Garlic bread, slightly burnt. He set candles on the table anyway, and I laughed, loving him for the effort. After we ate, he slid a small velvet box across the table. My heart stuttered as I opened it. Nestled inside was the necklace, sapphire glowing deep blue diamonds, catching the candlelight. My hand flew to my mouth. How? When? They returned it months ago under pressure from Vincent, he said softly. I kept it safe. I thought tonight was the right night to give it back to you. Tears welled in my eyes as he fastened it around my neck. The cool weight settled against my skin, heavy with memory and meaning. I walked to the mirror across the room, touched the stone, and for the first time I saw myself not as the abandoned daughter or the invisible sister, but as a woman who had endured and prevailed. My reflection smiled back at me, a genuine smile, not the forced one I had worn on my wedding day. Behind me, David came up and wrapped his arms around my waist. "It suits you," he whispered. I leaned into him, closing my eyes for a moment. It's not just jewelry. It's Grandma's love. And now it's back where it belongs. Months later, our daughter Claire was born. Holding her tiny fingers in mine, I made a silent vow she would never know the kind of favoritism and cruelty that had scarred me. She would grow up surrounded by love, celebrated for who she was, not compared to anyone else. Sometimes, late at night when the apartment was quiet and Claire slept peacefully in her crib, I would sit with the necklace in my hands. I imagined Evelyn watching us, her warm eyes, proud her voice reminding me that marriage was about love, not competition. I liked to believe she was smiling, knowing her gift had found its rightful place. The cycle of pain had ended. The silence I had carried for so long had finally spoken. If you've ever felt cast aside by the people who were supposed to love you most, remember this: patience and truth can be the strongest weapons. Justice may not come quickly, but it comes. And sometimes it arrives with more power than you ever imagined. So tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you have stayed silent and waited or confronted them right away?